This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 to 17. It's the basis for the sermon at the First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, August 23, 2026. It's part of our series called Faith Forward. So let's hear the text from 2 Samuel chapter 7, and I'll begin at verse 8. Now then, this is what you shall say to my servant David. This is what the Lord of armies says. I myself took you from the pasture, from following the sheep to be leader over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have eliminated all of your enemies from you. I will also make a great name for you, like the names of the great men who are on the earth. And I will establish a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again. Nor will malicious people oppress them anymore as previously, even from the day that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you, and that when your days are finished and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he does wrong, I will discipline him with a rod of men and with strokes of the sons of mankind. But my favor shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and all of this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Before we get into this specific text from 2 Samuel chapter 7, let's just pause for a moment and take a look at David's life, not in its totality, but at least from the time of King Saul's death up until this moment in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now, the books of Samuel tell the story of Israel's transition from judges to a king, and especially a king of God's own choosing. 1 Samuel opens with the story of Israel's final judge named Samuel, and he then becomes not only judge, but Israel's real first prophet. Here we read the story of Samuel's leadership and the people who demanded for a king, and Saul is the king chosen, at least by the people's standard, yet God would eventually reject him. So throughout 1 Samuel, we hear of King Saul and his son Jonathan, and eventually David, when Saul is rejected. And there's a lot of ups and downs to this story, but Saul eventually dies, as does his son Jonathan, with whom David is quite close. So 2 Samuel opens with David learning of Saul's death and his song of lament for King Saul. Now, following Saul's death, David does not automatically just become the new king over Israel as he was anointed to do by Samuel. In the case of the story we have in 2 Samuel, after Saul's death, we have Saul's right-hand man. His name is Abner. And instead of aligning himself behind David as the next in line to the throne of Israel, Abner sets up Saul's other son, not Jonathan, of course, who's died, but Ishbosheth, to be king over Israel. And in Israel here, we're not talking about Israel in terms of the total nation. It can be very confusing if you're reading through this because the names kind of move interchangeably. Ishbosheth is the king over Israel, which really means the northern tribes. It's not the southern tribes of Israel. Remember, there are 12 tribes that settled all over the land. One of them in particular was in the south, and that was Judah. So Ishbosheth kind of becomes king over that northern section of the nation, which we call here Israel. And David, he's made king over Judah, which is one of the southern tribes in what we would consider the modern-day Holy Land. And so most of the early chapters in 2 Samuel deal with David's eventual victory to become king over all of Israel. Now, throughout that story, he continues to fight with the Philistines while dealing with Abner, who eventually comes around. Unfortunately, when Abner comes around to get behind David's claim to the throne, Abner is killed by David's right-hand man named Joab. And this was right after David released Abner to go to the north to try to arrange to get the tribes of Israel to submit to David's authority as the king. So Abner, eventually wanted to be under David's rule in some way, but was not able to live long enough to do that because he was killed by Joab. So David, eventually, without having a claim to those northern tribes necessarily, he decided to settle in the chief city of Judah called Hebron. And he stayed there until Ishbosheth dies. Now, David had a number of wives while he was in Hebron, and his wives gave birth to a number of sons while he was in Hebron. Now, David, once Ishbosheth has died, he decides that he'd like to bring the Ark of the Covenant up to the newly conquered city of Jerusalem. Up till this point, Jerusalem has been controlled and inhabited by the Jebusites. And so David is able to take control of the city as part of his larger campaign to the north, in which all the tribes of Israel, not just Judah and the south, but all the tribes of the north, eventually submit to his leadership. So David eventually goes about bringing the ark up to Jerusalem, but there's a few starts and stops along the way. And then we read at in 2 Samuel chapter 6, the quite famous story about David bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and dancing before it with a linen ephod on. And as he's dancing around, he may have exposed himself a little bit. And so his first wife, Michal, is ashamed of his behavior. And Michal is King Saul's daughter, that is David's first wife. And the story tells us at the end of 2 Samuel 6 that in some way she is under, for lack of better words, a curse of some sort, because she dies having not borne any children to David at all, whereas his other wives did. So David declares in 2 Samuel 7, at the beginning of the chapter, that he wants to now build a temple for the Lord. In other words, a building to house the Ark of the Covenant, which up to this point had been in a tabernacle or a tent. So David wants to build a permanent structure. So the Lord tells David that I never asked for a house. And so now the stage is set for the entrance of the prophet Nathan and the text that we read a moment ago. Before we even get to that text, we have a key passageway that I think is really important for us. A generous spirit is a gift from God. A generous spirit is a gift from God. Throughout all these stories in 2 Samuel, in many ways, not all, but in many ways, David is generous to a fault. When Saul, who in many ways is the king who sought to kill David, he wept over Saul. And he wept over Jonathan when they died. He has this compassionate care about Saul and Jonathan both. Even when Abner had betrayed him, when Abner comes to speak with him, David welcomes him, despite the fact that Abner has waged war against him. And one of the reasons Joab kills Abner is because Abner killed Joab's brother. So that was a story about revenge, whereas David is trying to find ways toward reconciliation and engagement. And he even seeks to build a temple for the Lord in Jerusalem to replace the tabernacle. David is kind of living in this frame of a generous spirit. And time and again, we see David generous to friends and even his enemies, especially those close to him. We learn quickly how important being generous and forgiving can be. Rather than hold grudges, we probably should learn this faith of David, which is fully expressed, of course, in Jesus. Mercy, grace, generosity, these are the marks of a disciple of Jesus, even at times when it appears to be to a fault. And now we turn to our text specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning at verse 8. And this is Nathan the prophet who is speaking to David. And this is the first appearance of Nathan the prophet, offering him this word, this covenant that God is making with him. Now, Nathan is going to figure prominently in the story later, as you might remember that later on, David is going to witness Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop of her house. David, who lusts after her, he engages in an adulterous affair with her, wants her to be his wife. The problem is she's already married, so David has her husband Uriah killed in battle. So then David could marry Bathsheba. And after all this happens, Nathan the prophet is the one who comes to David to point out to him his sin that he's committed. So this is the same Nathan, but this is his first appearance in the Bible. And it's through this message that God has given Nathan to speak to David. Now, Nathan is told by the Lord to bring this message to David, which includes 3 promises to David directly. And we're going to focus on those 3 promises to David before we get to David's household and legacy later. This is all in response to David's desire to build a temple in Jerusalem for God. In other words, to house the Ark of the Covenant. So he had to do a variety of things before this could happen, and we read about them in those earlier chapters. He had to consolidate the kingdoms of Israel and Judah together. He had to defeat the Jebusites who controlled Jerusalem. He had to bring the ark up to the city of Jerusalem. David wants a house for God. But what we learn in this text and what we read here is that God is going to make a house for David. Now, this Hebrew word that's used here for house, the house David wants to build and the house of David that God is going to make, that word for house is the same word as dynasty. So don't think of it as house only as a structure or a building. House could be a reference to one's family or one's progeny, if you will. David, in this case, wants to build a literal house. God, in this text, is talking about a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7 contains a covenant in it, a covenant that God is making with David. Now, covenants in the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, they come in 2 different flavors. One is called a conditional covenant, and its technical name is called a dipluric covenant. There's your word for the day. And these covenants always contain if language in them, like, if you do this, then this will happen. If you don't do this, then this will happen or won't happen. That if language, that language of conditionality is key in a conditional covenant. If one party performs their function, then this is what will happen. Now, there's another flavor of covenant in the Bible, and it is an unconditional covenant. And its technical name is called a monopluric covenant. Now, these covenants contain no if language in them. In other words, it's a covenant where only one party promises to perform regardless of what the other party does. So there's no if or conditionality in it. So the Lord, through Nathan, now brings forth an unconditional covenant to David, a monopluric covenant to David. Verse 8 recounts that it is Yahweh that's brought all these blessings to David. It's not David himself. He was not the one who got this done. God is the one who did this amazing work. It says in verse 8, God speaks and says, I myself took you from the pastures. The emphasis on the I, and then it repeats itself. I myself took you from the pasture. So remember, there are 3 promises given to David here. The first one is in verse 9. It says, I will make a great name for you. This is a promise that's key to this kind of theological tradition that we read throughout Scripture. And it's a particular thread of theology that especially we read in the Old Testament. It's called the Deuteronomistic tradition. And all that means is that there's a kind of a theology laid out in the book of Deuteronomy about how God interacts with the people. And this language of I will make a great name for you is deeply part of that tradition or that theological lens, that it is God who acts to make a name great. You might remember the covenant God made with Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12. Uses very much the same idea. It says there, God says to Abraham that God will make his name great. Very similar language. I will make a great name for you here in the Davidic covenant. Now, the notion of a name here, of course, has to do with dynasty, of which David is going to be the first in a line or a dynasty which is going to follow him. Verse 10 brings us to the second promise, and it's this, where it says, I will establish a place for my people Israel. Now, this is about the land, but it also refers to the way in which Israel will always have an identity. The idea is that they're not going to be disturbed or oppressed again, according to this statement in the covenant. And one of the difficult things we have to wrestle with when we read the Davidic covenant here, the covenant made with David in 2 Samuel 7, is that we know that this doesn't happen. Where it says, it talks about how God's going to establish a place for his nation, and then no one's going to disturb them any longer, no one's going to oppress them anymore. Well, we know that doesn't happen. In 722, the Assyrian Empire, led by Sennacherib, completely sack and conquer the northern tribes of Israel and take them into exile and really more dispersion. And then barely 100 years later, plus, in about 605, then the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, completely destroy the southern kingdom of Judah and destroy the temple that Solomon has built there. And so this idea here is important that, God says that I'm going to establish a place for my people Israel, they'll never be disturbed or oppressed again. Well, we know that they do become disturbed and oppressed again in two different ways between the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But the covenant is true in David's lifetime. In David's lifetime and even in Solomon's lifetime, it's true. So we have to kind of hold on to that. Now, verse 11 has the final promise given to David, and it is this: I will give you rest. More specifically, it's a little bit related to how Yahweh will make a house for you. This is the dynasty that God is about to bring forth through David. That's the house that God's going to make. So when David dies, he will have a rest, but his dynasty lives on. Notice that in all of these verses we've looked at, there is no if-then language. And that makes it somewhat unique among the covenants. And the covenants that we know about, that we see explicitly in the Old Testament, are the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant God made with Abraham, the Mosaic covenant, the one made, of course, with Moses, the Davidic covenant, this one, and then the new covenant we read about in the book of Jeremiah. And all of that opens up a key passageway to us, and it's this: that the faithfulness of God is eternal. The faithfulness of God is eternal. The story in Samuel and Kings are filled with failures aplenty. Even with David, those failures are to come. So even in these deeply flawed humans, we still see the redemption and grace of God. It's not hidden at all. It's right there on the surface. And what a grace it is to see God make these promises to David, even with the foreknowledge of what is to come. So in many ways, faith is a matter of God's grace. God's faith toward us, in many ways, much more than our faith in Him. Now we turn to verses 12 to 17, and this isn't so much about David specifically as it is a covenant with the house of David. The covenant now makes a promise which extends beyond David and refers to his house. So much like Abraham, this is the part of the covenant that extends to a descendant after him. Notice it doesn't say descendants, it says descendant, singular. Now David has a number of sons with a number of wives, and many of his eldest sons meet a terrible fate. And if you continue reading the rest of 2 Samuel, you'll get kind of a picture of how all that takes place. So there's no statement here that David's legacy will pass to his oldest son. It is God who establishes the kingdom, just like God called David from the pasture to become king over Israel. Verse 13 in this text is key, that descendant will build a house for Yahweh, and his throne will last forever. So God speaks of how he will lead that descendant who will build a house. So David's not going to build a house for Yahweh. The descendant will. And that throne the descendant sits on will last forever. When God tells David through Nathan about this descendant, God says, I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me. So the notion here is that this is relational. This isn't about hierarchy. This is about the relationship between God and who that descendant is. That God will discipline him with the rod of men and strokes of the Son of Mankind. In other words, any kind of trouble or correction that comes to that descendant will come through some human agent. But, and here's the big but, my favor will not depart from him as it did with Saul, the text tells us. So even though there is going to be correction and discipline, God's favor, his faithfulness, will not depart from him as it did with Saul. And we know who this descendant is because we know the rest of the story. This is Solomon. Solomon's reign is clearly what's in mind here. Solomon is not even born when this word comes about. And then God doubles down on the promise of dynasty and household. In verse 16, it tells us that your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever. Those are some pretty sweeping, unconditional statements, but what is their meaning? Well, let's be honest. We know that the Davidic dynasty comes to an end. It comes to an end in the Babylonian exile when Nebuchadnezzar conquers the southern kingdom of Judah in 3 different waves in 605, 597, and 586. At that point, there is no king at all. And so we can read in the scriptures that happen after the exile that describe that time. Some of that is in the book of Jeremiah. Much of that is in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and in the prophetic books that speak of this, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They tell us of a figure after exile who is part of the Davidic line. His name is Zerubbabel. He is the one that led exiles back from Babylon to rebuild the temple of Solomon that had been destroyed. We learn in those texts that Zerubbabel is a descendant of David. He's in the Davidic line, but he doesn't become the new king. Well, what then? There's no king in Israel from the time of the last Davidic king, having been dethroned by Nebuchadnezzar. His name was Zedekiah. There's no king in Israel from 586 BCE all the way down to 166, when the Maccabean rebellion happens, when the Jews revolted against their Greek overlords. And that led to the installation of a new line of Jewish kings called the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans weren't Davidic, they're actually Greek. And then the Hasmonean dynasty eventually gave way to the Herodian dynasty that would come after them. They too are also not Davidic in line. So this covenant with David's house seems to go unfulfilled. It seems odd that David is promised an eternal kingdom in his house or his lineage, but it seems to all but evaporate. No wonder that Christians would claim this title, of course, for Jesus, because Jesus himself does. Remember the 3 promises given to David? Jesus claims all 3 of them. Both Matthew and Luke, in their genealogies, trace Jesus' lineage to the throne of David. So who is David's son? Solomon? Well, of course, in the context, yes. But that Davidic line has failed. So we move to a pure king in the line of David, and that Jesus himself is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. And that's what makes this passage of Scripture in 2 Samuel 7 so very important. This passage, perhaps above all others in the Old Testament, is most central to the promise of God's future. It opens a final key passageway for us, and it's this, that Jesus is the expression of the kingdom of God. The New Testament makes no apologies at all about Jesus being the fulfillment of this promise. As usual, when we read the text like this, we read it in its present implications between David and Solomon, but we also read it in its future implications leading to Jesus. So in this way, if we understand the claim of Jesus fully as a fulfillment of the Davidic lineage, then there's no other Davidic kingdom to come. Jesus is king over the one and true eternal kingdom spoken of here in 2 Samuel 7. Of course, this has a lot of implication for today's struggle. I'm sure the statement that I believe about modern Israel not being the fulfillment of this Davidic dynasty may cause some controversy with some, but I'm convinced as I read this story that we find the fulfillment of the Davidic kingdom in Jesus. And so in my opinion, when we say that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of the Davidic dynasty or a stepping stone on the way to the restoration of the Davidic dynasty, in some ways that's to set aside Jesus as the one true king of all, who is in the line of David himself. I want to thank you for listening to this week's podcast on FFMC. Listen in for our sermon podcast and for our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them right here in the FFMC podcast. I also encourage you to visit our website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.